Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Miller Center. I'm Ian McKee, Associate Professor here at the Center and Director of the Great Issues Program. Very pleased to have everyone here today for our event on climate change policy. This is actually the third event we've done in our Great Issues series this fall on the politics of climate change. Earlier events this semester included one on science and values in climate policy, and a second event on the conservative case for climate action. Today we have what we might think of as a report from the front lines, a conversation between the Miller Center's director, Bill Antholis, and Todd Stern. Todd Stern served as the US Special Envoy for climate change policy from 2009 to 2016. In this position, he was the chief US negotiator at the United Nations climate change conferences, culminating in the Paris climate talks. He's been working on this issue for more than 20 years. During the Clinton administration, Stern served as assistant to the president and White House staff secretary. He was also the senior White House negotiator at the Kyoto Protocol and Buenos Aires negotiations on climate change. Currently, he's a visiting lecturer at Yale Law School. He's also a graduate of Dartmouth College and Harvard Law School. Also introduce Bill, who will be leading the conversation. Most of you know Bill Antholis as director of the Miller Center. Before that, as managing director of the Brookings Institution. Bill has an extensive background in climate change policy as well. Also in the Clinton administration, he worked with Todd Stern as deputy director of the White House climate change policy team. Coming out of this experience, he's the co-author with Strobe Talbot of the book, get it right here, Fast Forward, Ethics and Politics in the Age of Global Warming. So this is an issue that's central to Bill's interests as well. One quick procedural note, we'll have some time at the end for questions from the audience. I would ask that you go to the back of the room where we'll have this microphone on the stand, line up, and we'll take as many questions as we possibly can. It should be a great event, and with that, I'm pleased to turn it over to Bill Antholis and Todd Stern. Gentlemen.
Thanks. Thank you, Guian, and thanks to Guian in particular, and Stephanie and his whole team for this great event series and the focus on climate change, which was their idea. I was delighted that they were interested in it. And I'm also really delighted to have Todd with us here. As Guian mentioned, I used to have the pleasure of working for Todd. That was a long time ago, and a lot has happened, and a lot has changed, and a lot has stayed the same in these negotiations. And I was explaining to Todd, and just looking around the room, there's a really distinguished crowd here of faculty, community members, students, and so it's a great time to explore where we've come from and where we might go. Just as a programming note, what Todd and I agreed to do is talk for about a half hour, maybe 40 minutes or so, lay out some basics, and then spend more than half the time in conversation with you all. So please start thinking about your questions now and line up and fire away. Todd in particular is ready to field all comers. So Todd, I thought we'd start with just sort of breaking it down a little bit in basic terms. One of my favorite phrases about climate change came from Dick Gephardt, who students may not remember, but those of my vintage will certainly remember him as the majority leader in the US House of Representatives, who has seen a political transaction or two in his day. And he described climate change as the most complex political transaction in the history of mankind. Okay, because our energy economy is about a sixth of the US economy. That means it's about the same size as healthcare. It has the regulatory complexity of healthcare, but you have to multiply that by 194 nations and do it all at the same time in order for it to succeed. So given that, let's break that down a little bit. First of all, it's a scientific problem and challenge, and I'm not a scientist, you're not a scientist. How do you think about that science challenge, particularly going into negotiations, and where are we now and where are we going?
Yeah, thank you, Bill. First of all, also let me just thank you very much for the invite. It's a pleasure to be here. Pleasure to be here at UVA, and any day that I spend some time with you is a good day. So I'm glad to be here. So look, the science challenge has tended to be framed in the science community itself by the objective of holding the the increase in global average temperature below 2 degrees Celsius as compared to pre-industrial times. That's a daunting goal, but it's a very serious goal. If you look at the drumbeat of 100-year events that we see all over the world, famines and droughts and floods, rising sea level, superstorms, and the like, you can see that this is already a serious problem. This is all happening at a level of temperature increase right now that's about 0.9 degrees. So 2 degrees is already more than twice that, and there are very serious things happening now. So for anybody who thinks, well, yeah, the 2 degrees, that's for the environmentalists who are all worked up, or that's for the scientists who are all worked up. As long as we can keep it kind of 3 or 4, we'll be okay. There's absolutely no reason for confidence, and Bill can attest to the fact that I came at this issue not as an environmentalist. I came at this issue very much as a pragmatic, kind of politics guy, but I think that is the reality. In terms of where we are, there's an outfit called the Climate Action Tracker that estimates what path we're on every year, and in the fall of 2014 estimated that where countries, where the aggregate path that we were at was pointed toward a 3.6 degree increase in temperature based on essentially on the actions that countries were taking under what had happened in in Copenhagen in 2009. A year later, based on the targets countries had put forward in the context of Paris, and we'll come to that later, they had shifted that from 3.6 to 2.7. Still way above 2, but a big step forward. There are what needs to be done in terms of the energy transformation or transition, and what needs to be done quickly in order to have a chance to move from that 2.7 down below 2 degrees is very, very significant, even daunting, but doable. But that broadly is kind of how I'd frame the science.
So as you framed it there, the critical piece is lowering greenhouse gas emissions. There are a whole number of different things that come into these negotiations.
Right.
But we often hear about targets and timetables.
Right.
How does that work, and how do they line up?
Well, so
What's a target?
Well, a target is when people talk about targets, they're talking about an intention of a country to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by X% by such and such a date. So, for example, in Copenhagen, which was a chaotic and difficult agreement.
This is 2009. You guys are in office for President Obama has just been elected.
Yes,
you're in office for a
year.
Right,
and just so people understand, there's a big international, global climate change meeting at the ministerial level every year. They are referred to as COPs, the Conference of the Parties. The first one was 1995, and every year. Paris was COP 21 in the lingo, and Copenhagen was COP 15. And now I've lost
2009, you go to Copenhagen. It's your first COP in the Obama administration.
Right.
A year before he gets elected, in the Grant Park speech, he says, this is the moment when the seas start reversing.
Yeah. So, but Copenhagen, in any event, was an important start. I've lost the thread of
okay, so we're targets and timetables.
Targets and timetables, right. So we agreed in the context of Copenhagen that the U.S., that we would reduce our emissions by around 17% by 2020, and other countries, not in any kind of universal way, but a fair number of countries also put forward those kinds of targets. And in Paris, when I was referring to that Climate Action Tracker estimate, that was based on some kind of targets having been put forward by, as we went into Paris, by some 186 countries. So all very different kinds of targets, but targets to say we're going to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by such and such an amount by such and such a year For us, in the Paris context, that year was 2025. Many countries, the year was 2030. But it's a statement of intention to reduce. In the case of some countries, developing countries, where they are on a steep upward slope, it might not be an absolute reduction below zero. It might be a reduction as compared to what their business as usual would otherwise be. So that's what a target and a timetable is.
Got it. So in the context of Copenhagen 2009, all the way up to Paris 2015, all of these countries are essentially pledging to make reductions of one kind or another.
Yeah, most of them in the context of the negotiation for Paris. So in that last year or two leading up to Paris.
And everybody's reductions are the same or different?
Different. So if you kind of go back for a second to Kyoto. So Kyoto was a completely different paradigm, an unsuccessful paradigm, but Kyoto was an agreement done in 1997. The original, the Granddaddy Treaty, was 1992. It's the Framework Convention on Climate Change. It sets broad principles, but nobody made specific pledges in the context of that 1992 agreement. 1997 was an agreement in which only developed countries were asked to make specific pledges. They negotiated on a top-down basis, so it wasn't just, I decide I'm going to do X. There was an intensive negotiation. I was there. That was my first experience with climate change. And it was a negotiation, again, just among developed countries. Fundamentally, it was a kind of a three-way core negotiation between the EU, the US, and Japan. And everybody had to agree to what everybody else was saying. So it wasn't just the US said, we're going to do X. We had to negotiate and agree on that. That's top-down, target and timetable. Totally different paradigm in Paris.
And in Kyoto, what were the developing countries obligated to do?
Nothing. See, there is, again, to just give you a little bit of background, there's a basic separation between developed and developing countries that's rooted in the underlying Framework Convention. Everybody had a generalized obligation to take steps to reduce their emissions, but there were no specific obligations for anybody. There was a set of the developed countries were listed in what famously became famous in this little hermetically sealed world. Those are the Annex 1 countries. So you were either Annex 1, i.e. developed, or you were non-Annex 1, i.e. developing. And there were differences, and those two categories were set and were important even back in 1992. In Kyoto, they became set in stone because the Kyoto Agreement, and you can argue that this was a mistake from the beginning, but the Kyoto Agreement was premised on the notion that developed countries only would negotiate targets and timetables, and a whole set of accompanying rules on transparency, so-called MRV, measuring, reporting, and verification, and compliance and accounting, a whole set of all of these things on a legally binding basis, and all of these things, that whole structure of the targets and timetables and the superstructure that surrounded it, all on a legally binding basis, but only for developed countries, not for developing. So that set in stone a basic kind of firewall. And
that's why the Senate preemptively rejects Kyoto, among other things.
Yeah, we actually, the Clinton administration never sent it to the Senate. The Clinton administration decided to go ahead and agree to essentially, you don't literally sign at the venue, but in the vernacular, to sign the agreement, to agree to Kyoto, and added a little coda that we wouldn't submit the thing to the Senate unless there was, quote, meaningful participation of developing countries. But that actually, it didn't come, and I was, at that point, new enough to this, green in the sense of not experienced, and this was, the key negotiating piece was always run out of the State Department then and now. It was not a very realistic notion that you were going to get to developing countries to do that. So it was never submitted by the administration to the Senate because there was no shot. I mean, it would have got very few votes.
So this is a perfect controlled experiment, because I worked with you on Kyoto and it was a failure. And then I didn't work with you in Copenhagen to Paris, and it succeeded.
Yeah.
So what changed when I wasn't there?
It's all Antholis.
Seriously, so there's a flip in this switch in this division between industrial and developing in Copenhagen. How did that happen? And what is the framework from Copenhagen to Paris that works?
Well, so, this was a long time coming. I mean, Paris worked. I joked to somebody on my team, so we're 7-year overnight sensations. I mean, this took a long time to negotiate this. So remember now we have the President Bush essentially pulls us out of the Kyoto effort early in 2001. Did it in a way that provoked a huge international backlash, sort of set in place the narrative of the U.S. as having a unilateral kind of cowboy foreign policy. Keep that in the back of your mind as we maybe talk about what's going to come next. You had that basically an 8-year period where the U.S. was engaged but not deeply engaged on the international side. We come in then in the beginning of 2009, of course. I had both had the experience of being in Copenhagen and then stayed another year and a half doing climate in the White House. So I did the next COP, which was in Buenos Aires, and I also stayed engaged. I joined a law firm in the intervening years, but I was also a fellow at the Center for American Progress and continuing to work on climate. So I was pretty tuned in, and I knew from the time I came in, and I continued conversations with colleagues who were career people at State, so all during that period. I knew that the Kyoto model was dead for us. We could not do that. When we jumped onto a moving train because there was a mandate set for a negotiation supposed to finish in Copenhagen. The world out there, the world of civil society and environmental groups and kind of the whole wide world had sky-high expectations that we were going to do the unified field theory agreement on climate change, that new treaty that was going to solve climate change. And we came in knowing that there was no shot. There was literally no shot of it as conceived by most people, which was
in the old Kyoto mindset.
Still fundamentally in the Kyoto mindset, a little bit different. I mean, some forward movement, but not nearly enough. And we knew that we couldn't do that kind of agreement. We couldn't have an agreement that was fundamentally premised on that kind of firewall, that kind of bifurcation, because you couldn't solve the problem substantively. I mean, remember, there's a dramatic shift going on in the real world economy in terms of economic growth and economic growth carrying with it emissions. So think about China in 1992 was about a third the size in terms of greenhouse gas emissions of the United States. By the time we got to Paris, they were hugely bigger than us. By 2020, they'll probably be literally twice the size of the United States. And I think right now the emissions are something like 25% worldwide, China 15% the United States, so already much bigger. And even in 2009, there was this very significant movement. So 65% of global emissions now are coming from the developing world. No criticism of the developing world. It's because they're developing. It's a good thing. But you can't deal with climate change without them substantively. And I'd been there and done that on the politics. We could not possibly do this in the United States on a bifurcated basis. We couldn't. There's just no shot to have political support for this. And there was also no point to do a new worldwide treaty and say, okay, well, if the U.S. can't do it, let other countries. Why? What's the point? I mean, you can't deal with this problem if the U.S. is in the middle of it. So we knew we had to do something totally different.
So how did you start doing that? China is obviously the elephant in the room on the issue. Tell us a little bit about how the relationship with China developed. Because frankly, during the Obama administration, relations with China started out bad and got worse on most every other issue. How is it on this? Not on this issue. How did that happen?
Well, so I mean, broadly speaking, we started to I'm going to get to China in just a half a second, but broadly speaking, we started to frame out a vision of a kind of agreement that might be able to work, and started to talk to countries in a quite intensive basis during 2009. We used a grouping of countries that actually had been pulled together by President Bush. They called it the Major Economies Meeting. We took that group of countries, essentially think of the G20, but the big developed and developing countries, almost the same as the G20, although it didn't include Argentina, Turkey, or Saudi Arabia, so 17 countries. And we started to carry on the dialogue about the kind of agreement that we thought was possible. We worked intensively with the Danes. Remember, each year the COP is someplace else, and wherever it is, that country has the COP presidency. So we worked intensively with the Danes, who ran a bad meeting at the end, but they were very smart during the course of the year and did a lot of good things. And it came to be understood by the Danish leaders on this issue, and my own counterpart, that we could not do a Kyoto kind of structure. We were going to have to do something that was more in the category of a politically binding rather than legally binding agreement, and that it was going to have to include, in some way, if not all the countries, at least all the major countries on the developing side. So a lot of conversation, which starts that year. Okay, now China. I came in knowing that China was going to be a huge, big imperative for us. I pulled together a group of China experts, even just in the first couple of months that I was there, I wanted to get smart about China. And I started to interact a lot with my counterpart, who, most people in this world moved on from time to time in other countries. My Chinese counterpart and I didn't move on. I eventually did. I left in May of this year, but for that whole 7 years, it was always the two of us. So and we started to work together quite closely, right from the get-go. I went on Secretary Clinton's very first trip that she took as secretary was to East Asia. She wanted that was already a signal with respect to the broader focus of U.S. foreign relations, that we were going to focus a lot on China and on East Asia. And she took me with her as a signal that we were going to focus on climate change. And so she went to Japan, Korea, China, and Indonesia, and I was with her. And I was with her in a prominently seated position. These sort of protocol places that you sit all matter in some countries. And meeting with every president and every prime minister, and that was already a signal that I think was important. We worked quite intensively all during that first term. It was very, very rocky in Copenhagen between the U.S. and China. There was public. Confrontation is too strong a word, but disputatiousness, if that's a word. The meeting itself was, again, a near disaster. Most countries still would describe it as a disaster. I think the two-page Copenhagen Accord that came out, I thought from the very beginning was going to be hugely important, but it certainly played as a mess And the Chinese came away very unhappy with how it had come out and how they looked. And although we didn't do this, there were other countries, the UK famously one of them, that really hit China very hard right afterwards.
So in the run-up to Kyoto, we in the United States felt all the pressure on us. By 2009 at Copenhagen, the Chinese are now feeling
a lot more. A lot more. All right, so then the Chinese come out in 2010. I wouldn't say it's a charm offensive, but they definitely wanted to work with us in a constructive way, in a way where disagreements would be handled privately. You know, I can't tell you how many times at bilateral meetings, one of the first things they would say is, okay, we won't criticize each other in public, because again, they thought that they came out off on I think the short end of the stick in 2009. By 2013, there was a real ramp up in the...
So now there's a new premier in China, or new president of China.
Yeah, there's right, exactly. President Xi Jinping. Secretary Kerry is on board now at the beginning of the second term. The president has already signaled, I mean, the president did a lot on climate change, which I would defend to the nines, even in the first term, but he really ramped it up in the second term, and he signaled that in his in the second inaugural, where I may be mistaken, but I don't think so. I think climate change is the only policy issue he references in the second inaugural. Also hits it hard on the State of the Union, and then there's a process that the White House runs that a number of us are also part of in that first part of 2013, culminating in the big speech that the president gives, powerful speech on climate change at Georgetown, and where he announces the so-called Climate Action Plan, which has a broad suite of major actions, the most famous of which is the Clean Power Plan. Brings in my old original mentor in Washington, John Podesta, to run the whole thing. And there's really a full tilt effort by the United States. So that's part of the second term. But there's also big international things that happen with China in 2013.
And how does that get teed up? There's a very famous early summit between the two presidents out in California.
Well, so the first thing that I think is really significant with China in 2013 started with my immediate boss, Secretary Kerry. He tracked me down. I was actually in my hometown in Chicago in a hotel, and he found me in the hotel room and called me up and said he's going to China in 10 days, and he wanted a strong statement between the United States and China, acknowledging the importance of China, climate change, and agreeing to work together, set up a new entity, a new kind of organizing tool, which became the US-China Climate Change Working Group, and told me to give him a draft statement the next day. So we did that, and then he made it tougher, and by just sort of dumb luck, my counterpart from China was on his way to the US, so we then spent about 3 days negotiating the statement, negotiating the terms of this new working group. Kerry goes a week later, announces it, and we're off to the races. And that working group was a device mostly for kind of bilateral clean energy cooperation, but it was a good, important vehicle at a high level, fed into the annual US-China strategic and economic dialogue. Okay, so that's all happening. Meanwhile, the president meets with President Xi at Sunnylands in California, their first meeting, and I, meanwhile, based on conversations with the White House, was trying to negotiate with my counterpart a joint short statement on the problem of HFCs. These are hydrofluorocarbons. It's an industrial gas. They're a small part of the problem now. They're growing at a very rapid clip because they're used basically for refrigeration. So they're growing enormously, particularly in India, all over the developing world, which is hot and which is developing. So you have needs for this stuff. I start this negotiation with him in China. We continue it then for almost every day on the phone for about the week or 10 days leading up to Sunnylands. There was probably 20 hours for 20 lines. Literally, it's that short. And that thing, which I didn't imagine this was going to be the centerpiece deliverable, if you will, out of the Sunnylands meeting, but it was. Because, if you think about it, so many issues that we deal with China are so frictional. Human rights and the Dalai Lama and economics and the South China Sea. I mean, one thing after another is just like a headache. And climate change isn't easy, but it's a place where we found it possible to make progress. So all of that happens in 2013. We then spin into, you can interrupt me if I'm talking too long. We spin into 2014, and Secretary Kerry calls me up to his office in January and says, okay, kind of what's the next big thing now? We had a good year in 2013. What's the encore? So I said, okay, let me go think about it, meet with my team. I'll come back to you in a few days. And I go down and meet with my team in our conference room, and we just kick ideas around. And somebody pipes up and says, what if the two presidents jointly announce our targets in the context of the Paris Agreement? We know the two presidents are getting together on the margins of some other meeting, I think maybe APEC, but in any event, in November in Beijing. I initially think Chinese will never buy it because they don't want to get crosswise with their closest allies, India, Brazil, South Africa, other developing countries, who would be annoyed with them for cozying up with the United States. But kind of almost by the time I get that reservation out of my mouth, I'm thinking, yeah, but this would be such a big deal from the point of view of the bilateral relationship between the United States and China, that there could be other players all the way up to the president outside just the narrow climate channel who thought, this would be a good thing. So
the real difference between Kyoto and Copenhagen is sitting in my seat with somebody that had a bright idea for how to break the logjam.
No, not at all. So we decided to do that. I talked to Kerry, he likes it. We talked to the White House, they like it. I go with Kerry to China in maybe February or so. And I first present it to my counterpart. Actually, I do this on the phone from, we stop over in Seoul because Kerry's got to meet with the South Koreans. But I don't need to be part of that meeting. So the night before we get to China, I call my counterpart and I say, I have an idea, I want to talk to you about this. And he listens, he doesn't say no. We go then, I talk with him more about it. Kerry, I'm with Kerry in meetings with President Xi and all the top level people, and Kerry flex it hard. And we're off to the races, and there's then a basically 9-month negotiation to produce both our mutual targets and the accompanying statement, which has some very important, heavily negotiated language in it, important in a way that's not necessarily clear to the naked eye, but that's very clear to climate negotiators. And when that thing then happened, and we somehow keep it secret, which is remarkable, actually. So, and we go all the way to, I'm leading from state, and my old mentor John Podesta, who's now leading the whole climate effort from the White House, and who spends most of his time on the domestic side, but joins up with me all during this year in doing this China deal. So John and I are in China several times, 2 or 3 times even in that fall. And we're not sure we can get this, we're not sure this is going to deliver even a week before. Because you have to remember that we can't, from our perspective, we cannot do this if what is getting put on the table by the Chinese in terms of their own target and in terms of the language of the agreement, of the short agreement, isn't what we consider to be good enough. Because what you don't want to have happen is to do this and have it backfire because people think that the U.S. and China have conspired to lowball the whole thing. I mean, then the big victory turns out to be a defeat. So, and that was not easy, but it happens. And the White House role very important, and the president's role important in the final discussions with Xi. And then you have the tableau of these two leaders, of the two 800-pound gorillas on climate, the two historic adversaries on this issue, the kind of big player on the developing side and big player on the developed side, who come out together. They kind of walk down the aisle together and make this announcement with this very important language that is also commits them to both to get the Paris deal done and to clear out whatever obstacles might come in the way. And it is just an absolutely galvanizing,
it's embraced, it's not criticized,
shocking announcement that is greeted with acclaim all over the world. The press was just caught completely off guard, which just elevated the level of their positive reaction. And the message to climate negotiators in countries all over the world was kind of, oh my God, this is actually going to happen.
Yes,
if the US and China can get to this place, we're going to get Paris done. Now, there was actually, there was a lot, even between that and getting Paris done, there was a lot of hard work, but that was the message, and that was, if I had to pick one thing that was the single most important factor in getting Paris done, I would say that, because it sent that message. And the thing that was most beguiling about this idea once I got my head around it was that I thought if we could get this deal done, that China would have a stake in getting Paris done that it was of a completely different order of magnitude than anything before. I had generally viewed whether I was right or wrong, we can debate whether I was right or wrong, but I had generally viewed the Chinese posture with respect to climate negotiations as fine to get done if it doesn't hurt us, fine to not get done if we don't get blamed. I thought that would be completely sort of revolutionized if we could get these two presidents walking down the aisle together so that the Chinese would need Paris to succeed just like we would. And I think that happened.
So I want to do about 2 more minutes and then turn to the audience for questions and just, Todd, have you reflect on a framework forward, this extraordinary, and Todd is not just a Chicago native but a lifelong Cubs fan. You have this sort of Cubs-like moment where people have been dooming these negotiations forever.
Not as good as the Cubs.
And this happens, right? It comes together with very...
You mean in Paris?
The Paris Agreement.
Right,
with surprising, watching on the outside, very little criticism even among conservatives in the United States.
Yeah.
One of the things more surprising to me than the agreement happened, was how little it was criticized U.S. domestically. Yeah. And then we get this, by nearly all accounts, unexpected presidential victory from someone, whether it was an offhand comment, whether it was a joke, as he referred to afterwards, saying that climate change is actually a Chinese hoax. So there's a lot of question and concern among people who have followed this closely about where domestic climate policy will go in a Trump administration, where the global negotiations will go in a Trump administration, as you and I discussed before. And it's a little too soon to say, obviously, but without trying to predict that, how should all of us think about the next, say, first year of an administration? What are the markers for knowing, is this framework going to stay in place, or is it going to all go off the rails?
Yeah. So I'm going to answer that. Let me just like one half second detour to sort of set that up, which is that if you had a question about the kind of impact diplomatically of getting Paris done, I think you could take a look, pre-election now, take a look at the kind of trifecta of successes that occurred this year on climate. The first was that the Paris Agreement entered into force. Entry into force was, there's a negotiated part of Paris that set the terms for that. It was a double threshold, at least 55 countries joining the agreement, representing at least 55% of global emissions. it was unheard of, unthinkable that it would happen that fast. Like, no agreement that's big, multilateral, complex agreement like this comes into effect that quickly. The president, the White House, we at State were very determined to try to make that happen. We wanted it to happen while we still had President Obama there, frankly. But fortunately, many other countries wanted it to happen too. The very last, so I left the State Department in May. The last thing that I negotiated with my counterpart, Xi Jinping, a great good friend at this point, was
a Cubs fan now.
I took him to a Cub game.
I was there.
You were there, exactly. Was that we would, that both countries were going to join the agreement this year. So hugely important, because I think 55% were already with the US and China, at 30+%. So you had entry into force. You had, remember those HFCs that I told you about? So that short agreement that took all those hours, the basis of that, the sort of crux of that agreement was we were going to regulate HFCs through the Montreal Protocol. Because why does it matter if it's the Montreal Protocol? The Montreal Protocol is a treaty that is still about the ozone hole. It's about ozone depleting substances. It's the most successful environmental treaty ever. It's actually worked. We hope Paris becomes even more successful, but Montreal has really been good and worked. And it's historically been a pretty pragmatic treaty. It hasn't been afflicted with the acrimony and polemical kind of style of the climate negotiations. The Chinese were very resistant to this initially. They made that first step, then there were some more steps. Anyway, fast forward to this year, an amendment was agreed to by the whole the body of the Montreal Protocol to phase down HFCs. Big, big step. Also, very, very difficult. There's something called the International Civil Aviation Commission Organization. That's what regulates all sorts of issues just having to do with the operation of airlines all over the world. Nothing to do with climate change most of the time, but also does have the mandate to regulate greenhouse gases, CO2. And very difficult negotiation. I was involved with a whole other thing, which is fascinating in its own regard in 2013, which I will not pause to explain because it would take too long. But suffice to say that after many years of trying a big new agreement in ICAO this fall to regulate CO2 emissions from aviation. So those three things all happened. They would not, and they were all hard negotiations, and they were all negotiations where China and others were on another side of us, and I completely believe that there was a desire not to have failure, right? So the Chinese might have wanted X, and it's not just the Chinese, Indians, many other countries, and we and others might have wanted Y, but there was a desire not to have it crash. Any of those things, entry into force, ICAO, HFCs, none of those things. Okay, so that's the backdrop. Now we have November 8th comes on the second day of this year's annual meeting of the COP in Marrakesh, which I was not at because I was already out of the department. And we come to your question. Look, I don't know yet. I don't think any of us know yet exactly what the president-elect is going to do on this issue, or his administration when he becomes president. Certainly, if you look at what he said in the campaign, it was bad. And it was, some of it was just sort of factually off in terms of what he said, for example, he was going to cancel the Paris Agreement. He didn't have any capacity to do that. He said he'd withdraw from the Paris Agreement. He actually can't do that from a formal standpoint for 4 years because it has entered into force. Had it not entered into force, he could have withdrawn right away, but now can't. Although you can de facto withdraw, you can turn your back on it, say, I got nothing to do with this, I don't believe in it, and that's still, obviously that's still a possibility. I think we don't know. I mean, he went to the New York Times a week or 2 weeks ago, whenever it was, and said he had an open mind. There are reports, which I've got no better capacity to evaluate the importance of these reports than anybody else in this room, but that his daughter and I think son-in-law too believe in climate change, think it's a real issue, and think it's important, and I think they will be important in the administration. Al Gore got an audience with Ivanka, and it turns out with Mr. Trump himself. So we don't know. But I think the notion that there will be anything like the all-in, switched-on, committed on the domestic side, just as much as the international side, kind of effort from the president on down that we saw with Obama, I certainly would not anticipate that. Whether we're going to have a walkaway, whether we're going to have benign neglect, or whether we're going to have something more positive than that on the international side, I don't know. One thing I will tell you is that I do not think that Paris will, whatever the Trump administration does, I do not think that the Paris Agreement is going to crash. I think that countries are invested in it. I think they wouldn't want to give, if that is the orientation, again, I hope it isn't, but if that were to be the orientation of the Trump administration, I don't think other countries would want to give the U.S. the satisfaction of thinking that they could pull Paris down. I think countries know that a very big thing was done in Paris to set up this architecture to carry us forward, universal, durable, strong, built. We didn't go into all the elements of Paris, which we can if you want at another time or later, but I just don't think, I think countries they're bought into the importance of the problem, and they're bought into the importance of the agreement. I think they know that if you were to blow Paris up, you'd have to do it all over again, and it'd be very, very hard to make it happen later. And I think also, if the Trump administration were to walk away from it, there would be very considerable anger, and I think actually it would be, even if the administration doesn't care about climate change, it would be a very foolish thing to do, because there would be so much collateral damage on the suite of national security equities and priorities that they have across the board, because he would be hearing about that. The new Secretary of State would be hearing about it everywhere he went or she went. So, I think that I would obviously hope that they don't do that, but if they did, I really don't see it falling apart. I do see it being not as effectively kind of further developed. There are things, it's perfectly normal in any kind of negotiation like that. There are kind of more detailed guidelines, for example, that are called for in any number of areas on transparency, accounting, finance, et cetera, that probably will get negotiated at the 2018 meeting. If the U.S. isn't a player there, it's not going to come out as well from our perspective. The U.S. was a very critical leader over the last 7 years of negotiations, and if we back off, even if we don't get outright hostile, it won't be as good. But it's going to go on,
So I want to turn now to you all for questions. I do want to note for everybody in the room that John Cannon from our law school here teaches a class on climate change and climate policy. I've been honored to be invited to lecture to the class, and this is the last meeting of that class. So I'm going to actually, after a question or two, make sure that some students in that class get a chance to ask questions in this as well, since I don't see any of them lining up yet, and I want to make sure that they do that. So please.
I'll step aside.
Okay, great. First question, please.
Thanks very much for your great efforts in doing these negotiations. But I really want to ask a question, but before that I want some clarification. The Paris Agreement, don't have any monitoring mechanisms in them. Is that correct or not?
No, it's not correct. We need to distinguish things that are legally binding and not legally binding, because you may have some reference to that. But actually, one of the things that is legally binding in the Paris Agreement is the article on what is sometimes called transparency, sometimes called MRV, monitoring, reporting, and verification. And that's, I think, quite a strong provision, and it is binding on countries. It calls for a common set of guidelines with flexibilities, leniency, in essence, to be provided to those developing countries who need it on the basis of their capacity. So that's an evolution away from the firewall. It's, yes, you can get some softer treatment if you need it on the basis of your capacity, but not just because. There is not a compliance regime yet in terms of punishment or penalty, and you're not going to see that anytime soon, because you just wouldn't get countries agreeing to that.
So let me, and then I'll sit down. But
yeah, the way that I distinguish that is there's verification, but there's self-enforcement, not centralized enforcement. And that's in other words, if it was a game of poker, everybody does have to turn over their cards at some point. There's no sheriff in the room. It's people around the table enforcing one another's behavior.
And that's, by the way, that is frequently true in international arrangements. It's hard to get.
In fact, if you look back at the Copenhagen COP, I wonder if, in fact, the pledges there actually turned out, with hindsight, to have worked the way they were supposed to.
You know what? So here's the deal. If you look at, there were probably, I don't know the number, probably in the 70s or 80s of countries that put forward some pledges. I'm not talking kind of broadly across the whole panoply, but if you look at the major countries, they have treated those pledges as deadly serious. The Chinese are bound and determined to meet theirs. The US has been, part of the inspiration for the Obama Climate Action Plan is to meet that 17% target. Now we have another target, a Paris target for 2025. You can look at the EU and many other countries. They're taking that very seriously. It's political stature, it's reputation. There's a lot of things that are, it might be the soft elements that have more to do with norms and again, things like reputation and standing, as opposed to the sheriff, but those things work.
Thank you.
So I'd like to take turns between a community member or faculty and a student, so if we can take a student's question now, next. Thanks.
Thank you again, Mr. Stern. This has been a really interesting talk. I had a question going back to your first point. You mentioned this 2-degree limit that we're trying to reach, and people have pointed out even under the initial Paris agreements, that doesn't quite get us there. So I'm curious what your thoughts are, maybe in the interim or outside of the international agreements, the roles of the private sector and maybe cities and local communities, both domestically and around the world, in achieving those reductions we need outside of those international agreements.
Right. So I think very important. I'm not sure they're not necessarily outside the international agreements. An element of Paris, which is very, very important, it was one of the critical elements for us, is the notion of 5-year cycles that are built into it. So starting in 2018, every 5 years, there's going to be what's called a global stocktake. This is an aggregate view of how the whole world is doing against our targets, including the below 2 degrees target, or goal. So, I think that it's built into Paris in those 5-year cycles. There's also a 5-year cycle starting every 5 years, starting in 2020, where individual countries' targets get reviewed and hopefully ratcheted up. Okay, so Is there an important role for subnationals, for states, provinces, cities, and also for the corporate sector, the private sector? Absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of that will hopefully get reflected in stronger and stronger national targets. But Paris essentially sets a framework. Paris sets the parameters within which we work. So Paris makes it possible for us in terms of actually getting on that 2-degree path. You've got to have national action supplemented by states and cities, and certainly at some level it's all about the private sector, because what the core of this involves is the transformation of the energy sector from high to low carbon. There's a tremendous ferment of activity going on in the private sector now. I mean, this transition has started, but the transition left to its own devices, it actually will happen, but it'll happen too slowly to be able to be on track for 2 degrees. And the U.S. government recently, the White House put out a so-called mid-century strategy, which is called for by one of the provisions in Paris, something that we fought hard to have included. And it talks about what would be needed. It's not a target. It's not a commitment per se. It's more of a scenario and more of a strategy that lays out what would our economy need to look like by 2050 to be in the range of 80 or more % reduction below 2005 levels. And I mean, just as an example, you would have an electricity system which right now is about 80% fossil fuels, which would be in single digits, if any, fossil fuels. You'd have a huge increase, 55% renewables, which are nowhere near that now, and then adding to that nuclear and adding to that certain kinds of combustion where emissions are captured. So this all all of that's going to take place in the private sector, but the way it's going to happen at the kind of accelerated level we need is pushed by policy. So these things have to go together. So it's not, well, there's the international agreement, there's a national action, but the private sector off somewhere else. These things have to link up together, and the thing to be worried about, I suppose, over the course of the next 4 years, again, I'm hoping for the best, is that if all of the policy effort goes away, you'll still see progress. It just won't be the same kind of thing. I think one thing you will see in the United States is that I anticipate, and I've already had some conversations with people that lead me to believe that this is going to happen, that you will have ramped up action in progressive states and cities that completely buy into this issue and are going to want to do even more than they're doing now.
Thank you.
It's hard to frame this question. It's about a matter that goes largely unspoken, but what is it that is at stake? What do we have on the line in your mental picture of what we're trying to save? Is it an ability to conduct business almost as usual, or is it go all the way to saving half the people on the planet, or what? What is at stake?
Well, that's an excellent question, because that's kind of the fundamental question at some point. I think an enormous amount is at stake. So just sort of give you an example. The latest science, which is based on some new insight with respect to the dynamics of the way ice sheets melt, kind of from within rather than just on the edges, has caused scientists, at least in one very recent and highly regarded study, to increase the projected potential for sea level rise this century from 3 feet to 6 feet. If you imagined sea level rise, anything near that, you would have tens, if not hundreds of millions of people all around the world at very significant risk. You would have a huge amount of essentially refugees being caused by that development, and people having to leave their homes and be on the move. If we think that if we need any lesson in the danger of mass migrations, we can just look at what's going on in a totally different context right now in Europe from the Middle East. So that's just one thing. I mean, I think that there's huge stress on water. Water availability is already in many parts of the world coming under stress. Stress of droughts, stress of floods. So just large-scale dislocations in countries. If you want to have any sense of what this could mean for national security, you don't have to look any further than the Quadrennial Defense Review, which is done by the Pentagon. So this isn't Greenpeace. This is not the Friends of the Earth. These are the generals in 2014, and they talk about the huge potential for climate change to be a force multiplier, essentially, for instability in important parts of the world. The head of Pacific Command, Admiral Locklear, former head, I guess, goes back 2 or 3 years, was famously quoted as saying that the biggest disruption that he saw on his horizon, he's the admiral, he's like worrying about national security, is from climate change. So it's very, very serious stuff. It is. If we don't do this right, we're going to have very large-scale dislocations.
This would be couched in terms like the climate disruption would take us to a point where our systems could not handle it.
I think that that's right. I mean, it's hard to project exactly, but I'm trying to think. I think it was maybe in a big Citigroup report. I might have these numbers wrong, but I think that they were projecting over I'm not sure if it was by 2050 or a little bit later than that, potential for something in the order of $44 trillion of damage. I was in a meeting with President Obama in the Roosevelt Room with maybe 15, 18 business executives around the table in the last about a year ago, a little more than a year ago, the fall of 2015, summer fall of 2015, and and he said he's capable of sounding sort of lighthearted and then hitting you with something pretty heavy. And he said that he's obviously has a pretty stressful job, and he has to deal with a lot of things that are stressful in the course of any day. But the one thing that he found, the one thing other than nuclear weapons that, in his judgment, has the potential to alter the course of human progress, those were his words, I still remember that, was climate change. To alter the course of human progress. I think it has that potential.
Thank you.
Go to a student now.
Thank you very much. I was wondering if during the discussions and negotiations over the Paris Agreement, you guys discussed the potential for its conflict with other areas of international law, most notably international investment law, considering after Kyoto there was a variety of international arbitrations revolving around countries trying to meet their targets, most notably being Vattenfall 1, in which...
I'm sorry, most notably...
Vattenfall versus Germany,
yeah.
Where Germany settled and allowed them to continue their coal plant without the scrubbers that they put on for Kyoto.
Well, the short answer to your question is I don't remember that. If that discussion happened, it happened in places that I was not focused. I mean, the place where there was some focus in the negotiations was the kind of overlapping area of international law where there was some discussion was international trade, and with a lot of concern by some countries to avoid using international trade as a mechanism to enforce efforts to push countries to lower emissions.
So an example of that, for instance, would be,
Well, India was the most concerned about that.
right, so that we, for instance, if we had more dramatic climate change laws in the United States and there was a concern by business or labor groups that this would adversely affect us, we might apply a tax at the border to countries that didn't act as dramatically, that would essentially force any good coming into the country to be produced in a way that paid that tax.
Right. That's not anything.
And that would be a violation of the World Trade Organization,
right,
potentially.
arguably, yeah. I mean, that's not anything that's kind of on the table now, but if you look at the cap and trade legislation that made it through the House but not the Senate in the 2009-10 period, there was a provision in there that called for something like that. Another place, one of the things that I referenced the agreement that was reached recently on aviation, but the drama there started years ago with the EU deciding to impose its cap and trade system, first of all, to include aviation, but not just European aviation, to include requirements for all airlines from all over the world flying into and out of Europe to essentially buy allowances for their emissions, and that was viewed with horror by many countries outside of Europe, and was viewed as a kind of something akin to that sort of inappropriate trade measure. And as I say, we could spend just as much time as we've spent right now just talking about that, but.
Yeah, I was also just thinking in the context of IP rights and patent law and considering the technology transfer requirements or at least inducements where that could be, because the private sector owns a lot of those.
Yes. So again, not discussion about investments so much, lots of discussion about IP, and the discussion about IP, international intellectual property, tended to be a push from some countries, again, India was very prominent among them, to loosen intellectual property protections for technology so that developing countries could get the technology without having to pay any license fees. And developed countries here, not just the US, but all over the world, being quite keen to maintain intellectual property protection at a quite high level, which I think is important, because the degree to which our innovation system is working full tilt is hugely important in our capacity to solve climate change, to deal with climate change in an effective way. And you're only going to get that innovation if you have strong intellectual property laws. I think you will see, over time, more and more developing countries will end up coming to that position because they will be the creators of intellectual property and won't want to lose it.
Next question.
Thank you very much for your work. I don't have a question, but I have a comment. For those of us who want to know what's at stake, National Geographic just came out with a 2-hour documentary called Before the Flood.
It's a great movie.
It's available on demand. And if you want to know what's at stake, they talk about 2050. That's 33 years from now. And it's very well done. Leonardo DiCaprio is the host of it. They spent a lot of time. It gives you a perspective of the world view and what the world looks, how they look at us. as a developed country and a leader in the world and what we're doing about global warming. So it's a very poignant film, and I would suggest that any of us that are interested take a look at it. And again, thank you for your
well, thank you, and I couldn't agree with you more. I watched it just a couple of weeks ago, and it's an excellent movie. There's also a National Geographic series on TV called The Years of Living Dangerously. They did one of these a couple of years ago. Now this is the second set of episodes of that, which is also quite good. But the DiCaprio movie is great.
Let me ask this question, Todd. Back when we were working together, I didn't get to meet a lot of movie stars on climate change. Is your movie EQ much higher these days? Are you getting to meet a lot of these people?
Not a lot of these people, but I was interviewed in, where was I now? I was interviewed in, it might have been in Paris actually, by Arnold Schwarzenegger for The Years of Living Dangerously. I wasn't telling you about it as a plug. But they use different celebrities to sort of be the host.
But the public salience has changed dramatically in 20 years.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. And DiCaprio's quite a smart guy. He spoke to the UN on one of the big climate meetings in the last year, so he was very good.
Next question.
So, thanks so much for having us, y'all. When we think about the effects of climate change that are being felt already and that will be felt in the future, the distribution of those effects plays a big role in the analysis. And I was wondering, you look back to sort of the early climate treaties, and the principles of climate equity played a big role in the distinction between developed and developing countries and their obligations and responsibilities. I just wonder if you could say a few words about the role that climate equity and climate justice considerations played in Paris and might play going forward.
I think they still play a big role. So you have an agreement which is not differentiated on the basis of the old firewall, but is still very much differentiated. I mean, the fundamental structure of the agreement is that countries come forward with nationally determined commitments. Contributions is the term of art. Which means that countries you sort of think about it as differentiated across the spectrum, not just in two categories. So, but you also have, significant undertakings with respect to financial assistance, technology assistance. The focus is much bigger now than it used to be on the issue of what goes by the name of adaptation in the climate world, so dealing with the impacts of climate change, building resilience, because even at best, even if we did everything right at full tilt, we're already experiencing impacts, and there's going to be a lot more. And if you think about this from the point of view of poor countries, I mean, there's 54 countries in Africa. A great many of them are in the least developed country category. They're not producing many emissions to speak of. The thing that they are fairly hugely focused on is adaptation, is resilience, because they are going to, and in some cases are experiencing the effects of climate change, even though they haven't contributed much to it. So I think that sense of equity and the need to provide the right kind of assistance to poor countries is very much still there. If it goes so far as to take the form of the old firewall, then you have no agreement, then you can't get the agreement done. So we had to work very hard to evolve the thing, but you can't lose that underlying reality. You couldn't, and if people felt that you were losing that underlying reality, you wouldn't get the agreement done. Remember, by the way, one thing that I didn't say, 194 countries, very complicated. Climate change implicates everybody's entire economy. The agreement works essentially on a consensus rule. So if 3 countries say no out of 194, you have no deal. So everybody's got to get on board.
Please.
Thank you. Many years ago, I learned at Yale about the Milankovitch cycle, and many of the climate change deniers bring up the Milankovitch cycle rather than the contribution of the Industrial Revolution. And does that come up when you're dealing with foreign ministers who may or may not deny global warming, but may use it to de-emphasize its urgency? And the second part of it, E.O. Wilson of Harvard has just published a book, and he claims, because of the urgency of this matter, that 80% of the plants and animals of the earth, especially the animals, will be extinct in the year 2020. And I wondered if this emergency and this agent come up in your discussions, either with the presidents or the foreign ministers.
Thanks for the question. You have two questions. On the first one, I would say no, that hasn't come up. But I would also say that the problem of climate denialism, if you want to use that term, is mostly an American phenomenon. So we ran into all kinds of difficulty with countries on all these various issues, on mitigation and transparency and the legal form of the agreement and the structure of the agreement and financing, and every issue it's difficult to find common ground. But we were fundamentally not running into the problem of countries saying they didn't believe in climate change. That's homegrown. The only other country where you really see a very highly politicized approach to climate change, really, that I ran into, was Australia, and they've had 3 different governments fall over the course of the last 8 or 10 years over climate change. So they have that.
Heavily dependent on coal mining is a big deal in
very heavy.
Australia.
So no, whether it's the cycle that you mentioned or for any other reason, denial generally is not something we ran into in the world. I have not read the E.O. Wilson book, but I don't know whether those numbers by 2020 are right or not. But certainly the notion of a large-scale loss of species is a really serious issue. I have a book. The lineup of books on my bedside table is unfortunately larger than I'm not making my way through them quickly enough. But one of them is Elizabeth Kolberg's book, The Sixth Extinction, and which is premised on the notion that there have been ever 5 big extinctions in the history of our world, and that we are living through now a 6th. So it's a huge big issue. So I appreciate you raising it.
Thank you for coming to speak with us today. My question is about, it's very related to the previous question, and it's that in the United States we seem to have a unique phenomenon where we have people opposed to efforts at climate change mitigation who kind of see it as a zero-sum game between economic growth and greenhouse gas emissions. And those tensions are felt, if not the same, even more acutely in the developing world. And I'm wondering what accounts for the difference in their willingness to embrace climate change mitigation efforts, whether they're psychological or economic or otherwise. What explains the difference between the United States and some of these other countries that are facing those same tensions?
Well, but is the premise of your question that they are not willing, or that they are willing?
That they are more willing. For example, I think China faces a more precarious situation because their regime many believe is built upon, or is predicated upon, high growth in high economic growth. But yet we see them willing to join this agreement when ostensibly they might have more at stake.
No, it's okay. So I want to just back up for a second, and I guess what I would say in my view, correct the record a little bit with respect to the United States. Put aside whatever is going to happen under a new administration, because we don't know yet. But there was huge progress made in the Obama administration. We did not have a lot of help from the Congress, but mostly using legislative authority. It wasn't just the president acting off on his own too, using the legislative authority pre-existing, like the Clean Air Act. Tremendous progress that was made. The president has lifted, for example, the efficiency standards for vehicles, the so-called CAFE standards, from 27 miles a gallon, moving up by the early 2020s to 54 miles a gallon. So a huge step there. The Clean Power Plan, we don't know what its fate's going to be in the new administration, but that's a huge step. It's over a third of our emissions, and the president has put in place regulation that would reduce those emissions in that sector 32% by 2030, by rights those reductions should continue. Standards for the appliances that run buildings. Buildings is a third of all of our emissions. A whole set of mandatory standards crunching down forcing efficiency on basically everything that runs buildings, right? So, strong new standards for significant reductions of methanes, another greenhouse gas, from the oil and gas sector. So just a very broad range of actions all over the administration with a lot of public support. So I don't think the U.S. is in a, why don't you act place. Indeed, I think the fact that we were doing that and that was visible to other countries really to me, very palpably increased the credibility and leverage. It's the credibility of the United States, and therefore the leverage that I had as a negotiator to try to push U.S. positions with respect to the international agreement. I mean, if you go in trying to push things and people look and they think you're a scofflaw, they don't listen to you very much. I think over, particularly the last 4 years, people tended to think that there was more going on domestically here in the United States than anywhere else in the world. So the other thing is, just to bear in mind, the kind of iron link between economic growth and emissions is exactly what has to be broken and what is in the process of breaking. And if you look at the United States, I'm going to forget these numbers now exactly, but since 2008, emissions have gone down something like 10%, while the economy has grown by 9 or 10%. So it's starting to diverge, and that's because you have more and more reliance on clean sources of it. First of all, efficiency means you need to use less energy to produce the same output of work. And then when you use solar and wind and technologies like that, you can do a lot without producing emissions. That's what has to happen worldwide. It's starting to happen. The only issue is, can it happen fast enough? It needs to happen at an accelerated level if we're going to meet the goals we have.
So let me jump in there. You didn't mention natural gas. There are some projections that the U.S. might meet its targets without significantly ramping up the Clean Power Plant Act simply by the natural gas revolution, particularly if it's allowed to move forward. One of the obstacles potentially in it moving forward is not just federal but local regulation about fracking, for instance, and the use of that. As an international negotiator, did those questions come up? Did you have a take on that? Did you engage in the domestic debates within the administration about how to deal with natural gas? Just give us I'm struck by how many people come to me talking about natural gas, pro and con, and I'm just curious to have you say something about that.
Well, I think natural gas, look, the development, which was much less of a policy development and more a kind of autonomous development in the real economy with respect to fracking and natural gas, those developments which produced a huge new reservoir of natural gas in the United States at a low price, had a big impact on causing utilities, independent of policy, to shift from coal to natural gas because natural gas was cheaper. And that development helped it was one of the contributors to reducing our emissions, although by no means the only one. So I think that natural gas is about half as polluting from a global warming standpoint as coal, so it's good in that respect. If you think about the need to get to what is sometimes referred to as net zero emissions in the second half of this century, which is what we would need to do in order to be able to meet the below 2 degree goals. Natural gas also can't be a long-term solution, but it's, in the White House mid-century strategy that I referred to earlier, I think there is an assumption that there would be a certain amount of natural gas, but single digits in the electricity mix by 2050. And again, the degree to which we can develop the technology called carbon capture and storage, which in my opinion, not so that we can go whole hog on opening up the coal plants, but because there are places, there's certain kinds of uses of energy that cannot, at least at this stage, be supplied by electricity. Certain kinds of heavy-duty industrial processes, moving heavy-duty trucks around the roads, things like that, where you're going to have, for at least some foreseeable future, some use of fossil fuel, and natural gas is better, and natural gas that you can capture, for which you can capture the emissions and either bury them or apply them in some use that technology is going to develop for us, makes it that much better. But figuring that natural gas is going to get us there and we'll just go gangbusters on natural gas, it will not get us there, but it's certainly better than coal.
Why don't we take one more question? We're coming up on 5:30, and then I think Todd will be able to hang out a little bit afterwards before we have to get him checked into his hotel and head to dinner. So please, last question.
Okay. I wanted to ask about more of the pragmatic ways we're going to go about reducing the emissions. And you've talked about how natural gas has been one of the principal causes that we've reduced the emissions relative to coal fuel power. But obviously, if we're going to reduce fossil fuel emissions significantly, we would have to find some other kind of baseload energy, because wind and solar just don't cut the mustard in terms of giving you continuous, reliable energy. Solar panels don't work well in a blizzard. And so we need to have a really good source of baseload energy. And James Hansen, who's arguably the father of global warming, head of NASA GISS for a long time, has been quoted as saying that he thinks we can't get there without nuclear power. Now, we know we have this form of nuclear power that was developed in the 60s, the molten salt nuclear reactors, which can't explode, don't produce much toxic waste, nuclear waste, it's low-grade waste, and actually can burn high-grade waste. And this was the way that we wanted to go with nuclear power back in the 60s, but Nixon shut it down because the military said they needed high-grade waste for their weapons. So what I'd like to know is, I understand that they shut down the working prototypes that we had for molten salt nuclear back in the 60s, and published all the results, and then went on to what we call now conventional nuclear, which has its drawbacks, as we've seen. So what I'd like to know is, what are we doing to redevelop molten salt nuclear? Do you know how much research is going into that? Just putting up wind and solar all over the planet is not going to do us very much good if we don't have a baseload energy. And I think the most effective baseload energy that I've heard about sounds like it's this molten salt nuclear reactors. And do you know anything about research being done? As I understand it, the Chinese are working pretty hard to develop it, but we're not doing that much.
So that's a really good question, and I'm going to be very disappointing on this one because I don't really know. I know that the foundation of the question you're asking is completely legitimate. We need obviously dependable power and baseload. There are a lot of people in the country. I think Steve Chu, who used to be the Secretary of DOE, was very interested in nuclear. I think Bill Gates is there's a lot of people very interested in nuclear and in enhancing the technologies. I can't speak to molten salt per se. And the one other thing I would say, though, is that there are obvious drawbacks with wind and solar based on their intermittency. There are also some very smart people who think, I believe NREL, our National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Colorado, did a study that showed that by, I don't know if it was 2050 or when it was, but that you could operate a very large percentage of our electricity system on wind and solar and other kinds of renewables, geothermal and whatnot. And I don't know if their premise had to do with various kinds of balancing of the energy within the utility system, or on forms of there's tremendous amount of development and research going on right now with respect to battery storage. I think we can get more, maybe more than you're assuming, from renewable, but I'm not arguing that we can get everything, and I'm not arguing against nuclear. I just can't give you a knowledgeable answer on the research question you asked.
Just seems like we should be putting our eggs in different baskets to
Yeah,
see which one works out best.
I don't disagree with that.
The better battery.
Right. I don't
Nuclear.
disagree with that.
Okay.
Well, I want to thank first Todd. You know, I like to say I was traded to Todd for a roll of stamps and a box of paper clips. When I tell my kids that, they don't use stamps or paper clips these days. But, you know, essentially the way it works in a White House is if you work for somebody and the sport that you're working with them on, the team, that sport goes out of season, they trade you to somebody else. And the trade to work for Todd was one of the great things in my professional career.
I have to interrupt and tell you how he really came to me, which is that I had the job of staff secretary. I won't go into the details of that. It's an interesting and pretty significant job in its own right. But I tended to get, as my predecessor, John Podesta, an original boss, also did, pulled into sort of assignments on the side. This last one, we started with all sorts of things kind of below the line, you know, whitewater and things like that. But the last one in 1997 that I got asked to jump into was climate change, which ended up eating my day job. And when I got this assignment, I went to Jim Steinberg, who was the Deputy National Security Advisor then, and a friend of mine, and I said, okay, I've just been asked to do this thing, and it's big, and it's the lead up to Kyoto, and I know that much about climate change. I need like the best guys, and I can get you know 2 or 3. Who's the best person I can possibly get? He said, Bill Antholis, get him. So that's actually what happened.
What you just saw is, in addition to being what we demonstrated for 90 minutes, one of the smartest, most specific, but also able to talk about issues in a broad way, one of the greatest and nicest public servants that I've gotten to work with. Also, I want to acknowledge in the back of the room Kevin Fay, who's on the board of visitors here. Todd and I met Kevin for the first time, at least it was the first time I met him, I'm not sure, in a Kobe beef bar in Kyoto in 1997. And we're, as a university community, really lucky and fortunate to having Kevin as part of us. He's, across these negotiations, been one of the real policy expert guides, particularly on this relatively narrow but hugely important issue that Todd mentioned before, which are these 6 man-made gases that are incredibly powerful in global warming. And I'm not sure if there's another expert on the planet in those as much as Kevin.
Kevin's been hugely important on that, but also very important across the board on the negotiations all the way back to 2009. So Kevin was really one of the stalwarts.
Yeah. And then the other stars, which is all of you, particularly our students in John Cannon's class, which for 9 years, or no, how many years? 5 years have you been teaching that class that I get to lecture in it? It's been a real pleasure for me. So thanks to all of you, and we look forward to doing more on this topic in the coming years.
Great. Good. Thank you very much. Sure. Thank you for coming. You're very welcome. Yeah.